What if the one habit most men never talk about, the one they do in private, alone, and never mention to their doctor, is quietly reshaping their brain chemistry, flattening their motivation, and pulling their testosterone response in a direction nobody warned them about? Not over years, not over months, but within days. There was a study, small but precise, where a group of men stopped a single habit for exactly 7 days. By day 7, one specific hormone had risen by 45%, not from exercise, not from medication, from stopping something. When the researchers published the findings, the response from the scientific community was not disbelief. It was silence, because nobody quite knew what to do with that number. So what actually happens inside the male body when this stops? And why does the answer involve your brain far more than it involves anything else? To understand what unfolds across 7 days of abstinence from masturbation, we need to start inside the brain, specifically inside the mesolimbic dopamine system. This is the brain's primary reward circuit. It connects the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex in a loop that governs motivation, drive, focus, and the anticipation of reward. Every time a person masturbates to orgasm, this circuit fires a significant dopamine pulse, a sharp, intense reward signal that the brain registers and remembers. The problem is not the dopamine itself. The problem is what happens to the receptors that receive it. With frequent repeated stimulation of this circuit, particularly when combined with high stimulation visual content, the dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens begin to downregulate. This is the brain's protective response to overstimulation. It reduces the number and sensitivity of receptors to prevent the system from being overwhelmed. The result is a phenomenon neuroscientists call tolerance. The same stimulus produces a weaker response over time, and when those receptors are downregulated, it is not just sexual reward that feels blunted. It is everything. Food tastes less interesting. Conversations feel less engaging. Goals feel less compelling. The baseline motivational tone of the entire brain quietly drops, and most people experiencing this have no idea why. Here is where the science becomes genuinely important. The downregulation of dopamine receptors from habitual overstimulation does not reverse overnight. Research on reward circuit recovery, studied extensively in the context of addiction neuroscience, shows that receptor sensitivity begins to normalize after a period of abstinence from the triggering stimulus. The timeline varies by individual, but measurable changes in dopamine receptor density have been observed within 5 to 10 days of abstinence in multiple animal and human neuroimaging studies. This is not a moral argument. It is a receptor recovery timeline. Now layer the hormonal dimension on top of this. The 2003 study published in the Journal of Zhejiang University, the one that produced the 45% figure mentioned at the start, found that serum testosterone levels in male participants peaked on day 7 of abstinence before returning toward baseline. Testosterone, beyond its role in sexual function, directly influences energy metabolism, red blood cell production, spatial cognition, competitive drive, and the anabolic signaling that governs muscle protein synthesis. A temporary but meaningful elevation in free testosterone has downstream effects on how a man feels, thinks, performs physically, and engages with challenges. The body is not simply withholding a hormone, it is redistributing biological resources in response to a behavioral change. What most people never consider is that the brain and the endocrine system are not separate systems running parallel programs. They are deeply integrated. The hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, the hormonal chain that begins in the brain and ends in testosterone production, responds to behavioral inputs, including patterns of sexual activity and abstinence, in ways that are measurable, predictable, and clinically meaningful. So what does this actually feel like across 7 days? And what specific changes should someone realistically expect and not expect? So what can someone realistically expect when they stop masturbating for 7 consecutive days? Not from anecdote, not from online forums, but from what the neuroscience and endocrinology research actually supports. The answer unfolds differently across each phase of the week, and understanding the day-by-day biological progression is what separates a grounded, useful expectation from either exaggerated promises or unnecessary dismissal. What follows is ranked from the earliest observable changes to the most significant shift that occurs by day 7, the one most people are completely unprepared for. The first thing most men notice within the first 24 to 48 hours is not strength or clarity, It is restlessness, a low-level agitation, a subtle difficulty settling into tasks that normally feel automatic. This is the dopamine system registering the absence of its habitual stimulus. The brain is not in distress, it is recalibrating. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse regulation and long-term decision-making, begins to reassert influence over the limbic reward system the moment the habitual pattern is interrupted. This neurological tug-of-war between impulse and regulation is uncomfortable in the short term, but it is also the first sign that the system is responding. The practical reality during this phase is reduced concentration and mild irritability for some individuals, both of which are nonspecific and temporary. Redirecting physical energy through exercise during this window is one of the most evidence-supported strategies for managing the neurological restlessness because physical exertion activates the same dopamine and norepinephrine pathways through a non-depleting mechanism. By the third and fourth day, something measurable begins shifting in the prefrontal cortex. As dopamine receptor sensitivity starts recovering from its downregulated state, the threshold for experiencing reward from everyday activities begins to normalize. Tasks that felt flat or unmotivating earlier in the week begin carrying more intrinsic pull. Focus improves, not dramatically, but noticeably. Many men report that eye contact feels more natural, social confidence increases modestly, and the internal mental noise that accompanies habitual overstimulation begins to quiet. But here is what most people miss about this phase. These changes are not about willpower or discipline producing psychological results. They are about receptor density recovering and baseline dopamine tone rising. The brain is physically rebuilding sensitivity. That is a neurochemical event, not a motivational one. Understanding this distinction removes the moral weight from the experience and replaces it with biological clarity. This is where the endocrine system enters the picture in a meaningful way. As the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis responds to the sustained change in behavioral pattern, luteinizing hormone, the pituitary signal that instructs the testes to produce testosterone, begins pulsing with greater amplitude. Free testosterone levels begin their measured climb toward the day 7 peak documented in the research. The physical correlates are subtle but real. Improved sleep quality, particularly deeper slow-wave sleep, is commonly reported during this phase. Muscle recovery after exercise feels more efficient. Resting energy levels stabilize. None of these changes are dramatic. They are the quiet background shift of a hormonal environment that has been given space to recalibrate. By day 7, the testosterone elevation reaches its documented peak. The 45% rise cited earlier is not a permanent new baseline. It is a temporary hormonal response, the body's measured reaction to a sustained behavioral change. What it represents clinically is a window. A brief, naturally occurring period where anabolic signaling, competitive drive, cognitive sharpness, and physical energy are operating at a heightened baseline. What a person does with that window determines whether any lasting benefit follows. Men who enter this window with structured exercise, focused work, and deliberate social engagement are essentially training in a hormonally optimized environment. Those who simply wait for the week to end return to baseline without capturing any downstream benefit. This needs to be stated clearly. 7 days of abstinence will not resolve pornography addiction, treat erectile dysfunction, fix relationship problems, or produce permanent hormonal change. Individual responses vary significantly based on age, baseline testosterone levels, frequency of prior behavior, overall health, and psychological relationship with the habit. The research in this area is still emerging, methodologically limited, and not yet sufficient to make definitive clinical recommendations. What the evidence does support is that the dopamine system responds to behavioral patterns, that recovery of receptor sensitivity follows abstinence, and that temporary testosterone elevation occurs around day 7. Everything beyond that is individual. And any persistent concerns about sexual health, motivation, hormonal balance, or mood deserve a proper clinical evaluation, not a self-directed experiment. Here's the one thing I want you to take from this. Whether you choose to try 7 days or not is entirely your decision, and it carries no moral weight in either direction. What matters is awareness. Awareness that the brain's reward system is plastic, meaning it changes in response to behavioral inputs. Awareness that dopamine receptor sensitivity directly influences your baseline experience of motivation, focus, and satisfaction in every area of life, not just one. And awareness that if you have been feeling unusually flat, unmotivated, or mentally foggy without a clear explanation, the reward circuit is always worth examining as a contributing factor. If those symptoms are persistent, speak to a doctor. Low testosterone, thyroid dysfunction, sleep disorders, and clinical depression all produce overlapping symptoms and all require proper evaluation. Do not self-diagnose from a YouTube video, including this one, but do pay attention to your patterns. The brain you are working with every day is shaped by what you do every day. That is not philosophy. That is neuroscience.